President Cyril Ramaphosa has met with U.S. President Joe Biden on the sidelines of the G7 summit, and that's to discuss the U.S.-South Africa bilateral relationship. Ramaphosa stressed the need to expand global COVID-19 vaccine supplies, while Biden agreed to donate to South Africa some of those 500 million Pfizer vaccines that the U.S. is distributing across the globe. Coronavirus vaccines certainly dominating discussions at that summit, in which 7 of the most advanced economies met to deliberate on the most pressing issues that are currently facing the globe. However, Ramaphosa will return home to a diplomatic row in at least 2 African countries that face expulsion of diplomatic staff for flouting rules on duty-free alcohol. What does this all mean? Let's bring in Dr. David Monyae. He's the director at the University of Johannesburg Center for China-Africa Studies. Joins us now via our video link. Doc, great to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Let's begin with the G7 summit. In a context where ultimately President Cyril Ramaphosa did not get all nations to agree to a relaxation of those IP rules in order to allow countries to produce their own vaccines, what do you think that says about multilateralism, even in the context of a global health crisis?
I think this demonstrates that multilateralism are at their weakest point. And I think it also tells a much more bigger story, which South Africa and quite a number of other developing countries are demanding. They need to transform these institutions. We really can't have small countries, as the Chinese say, dictating to what should happen in the world outside the United Nations system. There is a need to transform the UN, ensure that South Africa and quite a number of other African countries and developing world have a voice to exactly what's happening within these systems, as well as deal decisively with the situation that we're faced with, where pandemic is getting out of order, and there's a need to ensure that all countries that are capable of contributing should and must contribute equally to ensure that everyone is vaccinated throughout the world.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned the power dynamics that are at play. Ramaphosa had to awkwardly admit while speaking or answering questions at the G7 summit from some journalists, some of them in this country, about the setback that has come in the wake of us now having to discard these 2 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Do you think enough is being done to hold multinational corporations responsible for ways through which they make it difficult to fight COVID-19? Because surely they have a hand in this too.
Indeed. I think the biggest issue, it has absolutely nothing to do with President Ramaphosa or South Africa for that matter. The blame squarely goes to these multilateral companies that in themselves are driven mainly by profit. I think the demand by South Africa and India is that there is a need to put that waiver for the international the IP within the WTO to allow countries to use that knowledge to manufacture sufficient vaccines that are required across the world. This pandemic is affecting everyone, and there is a need of a comprehensive approach to ensure that everyone is vaccinated, to avoid having a situation where certain zones in the world are vaccinated while the bulk of people in the developing world are not.
Right. Of course, geopolitics not far removed from summits like the G7. The US and the UK arguably wanted to come out as strong as the perception is, right? As strong as people perceive them to be, perhaps I should say. How do you think they emerged at the end of this 3-day summit?
I think they really tried to speak with one voice after the disastrous 4 years of the former U.S. President Donald Trump. With President Biden, I think you see a consistent move for him to really demonstrate, firstly, to fellow Western countries that the U.S. leadership is back, as well as bringing in few countries, including South Africa. However, the issues at the global level are much more bigger than your G7. It requires all other emerging countries such as China, your Russia, your Brazil, Egypt, Nigeria. You need all these countries to be playing a constructive role. And unfortunately, when it came to other issues such as infrastructure, development within the developing country, I think you see divisions are sharpening and the drive for an aggressive approach towards China, which is very unfortunate that at this time in the world history, you need unity of all countries and ensure that you negotiate in a peaceful way where there are differences.
Yeah, you speak about China, and that brings to mind growing calls for South Africa to finally procure the vaccine that was made in China, as well as that made in Russia, by the way. Interesting commentary coming out from some quarters suggesting that what is actually at play here, again, is geopolitics. Because of that drive to isolate China, the allegation is that South Africa is deliberately ignoring that country and its vaccines to drive home that point. You work in the space between China and Africa relations. Does that sound like a probable strategy? And if so, is it a sustainable one?
If it is true, it is unsustainable, no doubt about it. But I think we still, the jury's still out there. We're still waiting for President Ramaphosa's position, and DERCO also confirmed it, that South Africa is testing the Russian and Chinese. I think the major concern is the delay in doing all this testing. Other countries such as Egypt, Brazil have moved fast, and they're using the Russian as well as the Chinese. And therefore, I think the health authorities in South Africa are required to do this test, given the agency and misfortunes that we have had with the vaccines coming from the Western world. I think what we need is a comprehensive, without choosing Western or Eastern vaccines. All we need is to ensure that we follow all due processes and we have a basket of all vaccines. And this is for security reasons as well. Should one be problematic in future, we save our people.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, it's on that point that government here at home is facing a lot of criticism. If we hadn't stored all our hope on Johnson & Johnson, this latest blunder wouldn't be that big a blow to our inoculation drive. I'm interested in how we actually view vaccines in the context of countries interacting on the global stage. There had been a lot of talk around ensuring that it's people who are prioritized before profits. That on many scores isn't happening. But do you think we are in a stage now where vaccines are actually the new currency in how countries interact, again, given the pandemic?
Indeed, vaccines are now taking a center stage, and this is the most important item in the world at the moment, more expensive, in demand, everyone requiring it. But the major lessons for us in South Africa as well as Africa is that what do we do going forward? Should we really depend on Western world or Russia and China? I think what is required is for us to ensure that the Africa CDC is strengthened, the limited knowledge on the African continent is somehow boosted to ensure that we learn about these pandemics and manufacture the entire vaccine and contribute massively to the global value chain to ensure that future pandemics we are not dependent and we're the last one to be considered. Or this language which is very patronizing, where we are given or donated, as they put it. I think we need to ensure that we have resources. We need to be in the forefront of getting these vaccines. And African lives are as important as Western lives.
Yeah. What's that saying? Do as I do, don't necessarily do as I say. The G7 nation or countries in the G7 want us to believe that they are doing all they can to ensure that there's an equal distribution of vaccines. But as you rightly mentioned, these donations could very well be seen as just increasing dependency as opposed to increasing these countries' ability to actually fight the virus.
We're going back to where we were in the 60s and 70s, where the gap between the rich and the poor countries is widening, and things such as vaccines are worsening the situation. And while we're looking at the vaccines and the other major issues, our economy, they depend on tourism and a number of areas that are being affected. And therefore, I think the crisis coming out of this pandemic is much more bigger than what is being told out there. It's affecting ordinary people's lives. Unemployment is widening, and not just in South Africa, everywhere you go. And therefore, there is a need for our leaders to speak with one voice and avoid getting bogged into the fights between Westerners and China. I think what we need is to ensure that we speak and advance our interests and get what we require and need.
Absolutely. The president is facing a long list of issues potentially when he gets back home. One of them we've also just mentioned, that's the diplomatic row, if you like, with those diplomats that have now been expelled from this country because of their involvement in duty-free alcohol trade. We're told they have flouted regulations. How does the president deal with that without breaking ties with these affected countries, or at least severing them?
Now, this is a very clear-cut case. I think a major investigation was taken, and the mere fact that diplomats will float clear laws in this country, I think it is unacceptable, and I think it's a proper diplomatic channels were followed, and I doubt very much that there will be any further disturbances in terms of our relationship with Malawi and Lesotho. And I think more, as Derko says, there will be more diplomats found to have violated these rules, and South Africa needs to take a very hard stand. While we're doing that, I think we also need to ensure that our own diplomats are behaving well wherever they are, because in times like this, countries have a tendency of showing us that we are not as clean ourselves as we are telling the world that we need diplomats to behave to ensure that they follow the rules and regulations and laws of this country.
Yeah, we may have our own Smallingana skeleton somewhere else around the world, might not we? Thanks very much indeed for your time. Really interesting to watch the balance of power on the global stage as we continue to fight COVID-19 here at home. Really appreciate your insights. Dr. David Monyae is with the University of Johannesburg. He's at the Center for China-Africa Studies. Once again, thanks very much indeed.